Moi ta remè konè, date jou m'ap mouri.
Yeah. Sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre. Et puis nous connaissons ta pas mourir. 24 ans. Qui ça t'a fait? Yo. Si m'te gen 24 ans pour vivre, moi t'as pas le checker mamie, dit li te fait un bon travail avec premier petit li. Le yo te relè m'volè, assassin li pas jam la guerre, li te toujours kembe. Bol sous fond tête li, après ça prend la rue. 2h30, relè Gérald dit Plessidil. Vin chercher déposer camadam moi gade j'en habillé bien fin. Li di oui clef en allemand j'ai nan tap. Moi dis moi pas cap, passer demain moi pas plat. Moi seulement vin remercier ou à tout cœur passer bagay. Moi t'es fort passer ou pas même t'es doué rester avec. Ou c'est une belle fille, ou pas besoin crier. Depuis où est malé, ou m'être remarié.
Moi ta remè konè, date jou m'ap mouri.
Sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non, sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé.
Après ça, moi sorti dans le calan, moi entré dans la machine, pick up cellulaire à col si frère non. Allo, parel lo a marché dans la rue, si veillé yo, yo gen un pile jalousie. Même nèg ou k'ap touye moun pou, c'est même nèg yo k'ap mette zam sou. Parel, di frère non Samuel, c'est lui même qui bosse. Moi t'as des lits du pour le dormir, après le te fait un divorce. Mais bon Dieu a pas le force, quand ou Samson, mais si veye femme qui vient en démon sans protection. Et pas oublier protéger au savon, moi gen yon zam en bas matelas, côté Bible là. Et nèg k'ap mande qui est-ce qui au savon, moi gen décès, c'est lui même qui bébé. L'autre lan li pi grand, yoré le melki. Depuis les petits la pour mes garçons à filles. Des pour de respecter famille, ou à balle raison. Pour les piquer ou les paquets s'il prend prison. Mais dis cousin Mwenel, contrôlez yo. Parce que si y'a pas ça, y'a touye yo. Et dis Kif, Elijah Raymond, Junior Joshua, yo pas mafia.
Moi ta remè konè, date jou m'ap mouri.
Sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non, sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non.
Les cousins Diana t'entendent m'bral mourir. Relé ambulance, li tombe prend crise. Moi gen inet arrêté dans New York City. Après ça moi supposé avec Biggie dans paradis. C'est là ça moi changer zami moi Haitian Jack. Si tellement nos amis nous relé tête nos cousins l'en a fait ça. Et pas gen bodyguard, moi gen un grand frère que relé Big B sleep à jumper. Et non pas jumper. Moi t'entendais moun ap crier, moi garder monte lan l'air arrivé. Chaise tombe écrasée, famille tombe relé. C'est là ça ti sem nan di me lever ou ta prévé clair.
Moi ta remè konè, date jou m'ap mouri.
Sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non, sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non, si yo râlé, si yo râlé.
Jean Mignon, Ariel, Jaman, Grégory, Warner, Patricia, Venda, Nancy, Gardons rêve, Mr. Pierre Moun Jérémy, non style là, Gardons rêve.
Sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non, sou te gen 24 ans pour vivre, est-ce qu'on t'a chanté, est-ce qu'on t'a dansé, est-ce qu'on t'a crié, si yo râlé, si yo râlé. Non, si yo râlé, si yo râlé.
Jean Mignon, Ariel, Jaman, Grégory, Warner, Patricia, Venda, Nancy, Gardons rêve, Mr. Pierre Moun Jérémy, non style là, Gardons rêve.
Hello and good afternoon. I want to welcome you to this event on W.E.B Du Bois in Latin America and the Caribbean, Trans-American Pan-Africanism and Global Sociology. We're very excited to have 3 speakers with us today, and we'll have 2 MSU faculty who will co-moderate the event. The first of them is Leonora Paula, who's in the Department of English at Michigan State University. The second is Rashida Harrison in the College of James Madison at Michigan State University. Rashida is the co-director of, or the organizer of our co-sponsor for this event, MSU Race in the 21st Century Americas Conference. Leonora will introduce our speakers for today, and Rashida will introduce the event and set it in context. And so I'm happy to leave you now in their hands.
All right. Thank you, Lori. I'm actually going to speak first before Leonora. And I just want to, again, thank you, Lori. Thank you to CLACS. Thank you for inviting the Race in the 21st Century Americas Conference to be a part of this as a co-sponsor. And thank you, Leonora, for inviting me to be a part of this event as well. And obviously, thank you everyone who are joining us today. W.E.B Du Bois serves as a foundational scholar for so many fields and branches of research that are interested in race, creations of social inequality, radical movements and activism, Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, Black internationalism, African diaspora politics, and the list can go on. In addition, his work offers distinct underpinnings to sociological understandings of social hierarchies in the modern world. It is always exciting when there is a revisiting of his work, illustrating his timeless brilliance on race, capital, and colonialism for the modern era. It is also necessary and timely given the global potential for transnational organizing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in the face of global, capitalist, white supremacist settler colonialism. It's a mouthful, but offers important descriptors for what's at stake in larger fights for freedom and justice. I must admit that my knowledge of Du Bois's particular contribution to Latin America and Caribbean studies is limited. So I was excited when I read about the important work being done by our 3 panelists today. The book, again entitled Du Bois on Latin America and the Caribbean, Trans-American Pan-Africanism and Global Sociology. It's the first volume that focuses on Du Bois's relation to Latin America and the Caribbean, dealing with his research and writings about the Americas, as well as his interventions as a public intellectual and political activist. Obviously, the co-authors will expand upon this, but for our audience's purposes, the main argument of the book is that Du Bois's analytics of the modern world is founded on a matrix of power that articulates capitalism, racism, and colonialism, and that his analytics emerged of his primary intellectual and political identity as a trans-American Pan-Africanist. And I'm really interested in unpacking that identifying marker of him. The 3 authors contend that nonetheless, his analysis, writings, and interventions south of the Rio Grande in the Americas had not been submitted to any comprehensive investigation, and that significance is barely recognized. Du Bois on Latin America and the Caribbean is there to fill this gap, and our co-authors had the opportunity, given their affiliation with the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and they hold Du Bois's papers. So they've had the opportunity to be able to go to Du Bois's writings. And for us scholars, we love primary research. And they're able to do the original research on his writings and engagements with Latin America and the Caribbean, paying particular attention to Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti. I'm looking forward not only to today's conversations, but also the forthcoming book, as it will aid in more critical engagement and perspectives of Du Bois as it applies to a variety of historical and political moments. So thank you. I am looking forward to this.
Thank you, Rashida. I hope you can all hear me. Yes? Okay, good. Thank you for that introduction. Before I introduce the panelists or the speakers, I just want to thank you again for agreeing to co-sponsor this event. And I want to thank Lori Medina as well as the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at MSU for always partnering with whatever ideas I bring to them that will foster, the growing field of Afro Latin American studies. So CLACS is always supportive of these projects, and they jumped on board right away when I came to them with the idea for this book presentation after talking to Juliana about it. So thank you, Lori, again for that, and thank you for all of the CLACS staff as well. So let me introduce the panelists, and I'll also mention the title of their presentations, and then we can hear from them, which is the most interesting part of this conversation. So our first speaker will be Agustin Lao-Montes. He's an associate professor of sociology and Afro-American studies. He is a coordinator of the graduate certificate African diaspora studies in the W.E.B Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Agustin is the author of many volumes. I'm just going to mention a few. He is the author of the book Contrapunteos Diaspóricos, Cartografías Políticas de Nuestra Afroamérica, which looks like it's just been published. He's also the co-editor of Beyond Civil Society, Activism, Participation, and Protest in Latin America, and also the co-editor of Tecnofuturos, Critical Interventions in Latino Studies. The title of Agustin's presentation will be Maroon Nation, Racial Capitalism and Empire in the Pan-African Horizon of W.E.B Du Bois. Our next panelist will be Juliana Góes. She is a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, like all of our panelists. Her research interests are social movements, post-colonial and decolonial theory, race, gender, and Latin American, as well as urban studies. She is the author of many articles. I'm going to cite a couple. One of them is titled De João Pedro até George Floyd, which is published in the journal Polifonia por la Vida de la Corona Crisis a la Primavera de Ébano. She's also the author, along with Agustin, of Nossa Améfrica en clave dos feminismos pretos, el imaginario geohistórico de Lele González, that came out in a LASA publication. The title of Juliana's presentation today will be Brazil and Du Bois, Challenges to Build a Trans-American Pan-Africanism. And our last panelist will be Jorge Daniel Vásquez. He is a doctor in education at La Salle University in Costa Rica, and he's also a PhD candidate in sociology at Amherst as well. He is a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Ecuador, and visiting professor in the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, Flasco. His research integrates critical theory, sociology of globalization, sociology of race and ethnicity, in order to analyze processes of migration and culture. His latest publication is a co-authored volume, Economía Política del Conocimiento en el Sur Global, Universidad y Ciencias Sociales en Ecuador y Tanzania. The title of for his presentation will be W.E.B Du Bois and Cuba, Anti-Racist Connections. So please join me in welcoming all our panelists. And Jorge, I believe Agustin will start.
Well, first, thank you to the Michigan State University for this generous invitation. And we're really happy to present this book before it's published so that we can start the dialogue. Hopefully it will be published in the next few months. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. So, and particularly I want to say thank you to Laurie, to Rashida, and to Leonora, and to Rael, who's actually behind the thing and who's been working with us for this event. I gave it a general, the same title of the book to the presentation, Du Bois in Latin America, Trans-American Pan-Africanism and Global Sociology, and co-authored by the three of us, myself, Juliana Moraes, I did a mistake in writing the first last name, Moraes Góes, and Jorge Daniel Vásquez. Next. Two images of Du Bois. Du Bois is, we're quite familiar with Du Bois, but we're not sure that everybody is in the audience. So this is the young Du Bois on his desk and with the first child. And next. A little bit about Du Bois. Who is W.E.B Du Bois? He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and part of the reason why we have the collections of Du Bois papers is that he was born nearby the University of Massachusetts, and actually his son David Du Bois and a prominent scholar activist was his wife also. Shirley Grant Du Bois is also working on our department. They both of them taught in our Department of American Studies. The most productive and influential Black intellectual activist of the 20th century, published over 20 books. We highlight his doctoral dissertation, The Suppression of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which pioneered the Atlantic studies in the late 19th century, 1897. The Philadelphia Negro, 1899, that persists more than 2 decades. The celebrated Chicago School on American Sociology, Urban Studies in particular. The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, predecessors of cultural studies, and Black Reconstruction in America, 1935, a landmark in the Black radical tradition and in Black Marxism. As an activist, it's outstanding that he was founder of the NAACP in 1909, the key organizer of Pan-African Congresses since 1900, the editor of important journals such as The Crisis of the NAACP and Pylon. At the end of in the second time that he worked at the Atlanta University, Pylon is still published. He was of socialist and radical democratic political vocation through his life and was persecuted through the McCarthy's anti-communist policies of the U.S. government. Partly because of this, he died in Ghana. Next, please. We are today enjoying what we can call a Duboisian Renaissance. No, Du Bois is recognized as a fundamental figure in African studies. He was a member of the American Negro Academy since 1897, before there were any Black studies in American universities. Founder of Black Studies since his first job at Atlanta University in the early 20th century. Our department in UMass of American Studies that had the first doctoral program in the field in the U.S., as well as our library where we have his original papers, as we said before, are named after Du Bois. Our work can be framed within what we call a Duboisian Renaissance in intellectual cultures and the public spheres at large. Du Bois is present and gaining momentum across fields and disciplines, as Rashida very clearly said. Three important examples to give in the very short period that have the presentation. One, the recent rise of Black Marxism with the recognition and revival of the Black radical tradition. It's a pioneers the Black radical tradition. Second, his significance for critical theory in general, from the standpoint that Raylan Rabaka calls African critical theory. And all of this is food for thought for us to talk for a long time about it. And the third example, and this is part of the reason why the book is subtitled Global Sociology, is what we call the Du Boisian turn in American sociology. Here we highlight two recently published books, Aldo Morris, A Scholar Denied, W.E.B Du Bois and the Birth of Modern Sociology, where the author demonstrates that Du Bois, one of the first PhDs in sociology in the US, some people say the first, inaugurated various fields of social research, including historical and urban sociology. The other is Jose Hutchinson and Carida Brown's The Sociology of W.E.B Du Bois, Racialized Modernity and the Global Color Line, who present Du Bois as what we can call a classical sociologist, along with figures such as Marx and Weber. I mean, no minor than them, with his own theory of modernity and sociological method, where in the racial where in the racial dimension is central to the understand modernity itself. As Rashida said, also understanding this power matrix in the relationship between racism, colonialism, and capitalism. Next, please. Why a book on Du Bois on Latin America and the Caribbean? And we'll have much more time in the presentations of the chapters and in the conversation, in the dialogue, to explain that much more, to flesh it out and unpack it. As Judith Hooker argued in her book, Theorizing Race in the Americas, an important way to characterize Du Bois is as a trans-American intellectual activist whose scholarship and activism were always framed in world historical as well as regional perspective. However, there is little research focused on what we call Du Bois trans-American Pan-Africanism. And by that, we mean that his framing of racialized modernity in his activism as a militant in struggles for emancipation, always had not only a U.S. but a trans-American and world also, but the Americas as a unit of analysis for theory, for research, and for activism were always key for Du Bois. And Pan-Africanism, because that is his intellectual and political identity, which is analogous, which is the predecessor of what we call today African diaspora. No, I mean, the African diasporas in the Americas as a whole was a key reference for Du Bois' intellectual and political project and action. To fill that gap, our book will look into Du Bois' engagements, writing, visits, relationships, public interventions with three countries, Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti, which are key centers of Black history, culture, and politics in the Americas, and which were key for Du Bois. The three chapters, product of archival research at the Du Bois Papers at are product of archival research at the Du Bois Papers at UMass Amherst Library. Next, please. Haiti was a lifetime reference for Du Bois. His father, Alfred, was born in Haiti in 1825. We gave him a Caribbean identity relevant in his lifetime engagement as a trans-American Pan-African perspective. That we can see clearly since the publication of his book, The Negro, in 1915, but also before that, his engagement in Pan-African Conference in 1900, even in Souls of Black Folk, and when he talked about the darkest races of the world, he is already thinking about that trans-American Pan-Africanist perspective. Du Bois wrote about Haiti throughout his life, beginning in 1915 in the context of the U.S. invasion of Haiti until the end of his life, and the first Pan-African Conference, 1900, at the beginning, to his last work centered on Haiti, The Negro and the French Revolution, published in Ghana in 1962 at the end of his life. Three key moments in his relationship with Haiti are: one, actions and writing against the U.S. occupation of Haiti, 1915 to 1934, and that's extremely important in my chapter that I won't be able to detail here because also introducing the book in general. He actually wrote a lot during that period, and you see the changes in Du Bois' actually understanding of modernity or race and his politics in that very intense 19-year period in which he was a pioneer in world activism against the U.S. occupation of Haiti. Second, Du Bois' first visit to Haiti in 1944, invited by the U.S. and Haitian governments to do teacher training, interested in an important moment of radicalization of Du Bois' theory and politics, the mid-1940s. Third, his second and last visit to Haiti in 1955 with Shirley Grant Du Bois, who's his wife until the end of his life, his second wife, and an incredible scholar, activist herself, who actually was important in the intellectual political engagement, much more radical Du Bois in that third moment of his life, 1955. And he went to Haiti without a passport because his passports had been taken away. Next, please. Maroon Nation, Racial Capitalism and Empire in the Pan-African Horizon of Du Bois is the title of my chapter. And here there are two quotes at the beginning from an article that he published in The Crisis in 1915. Interpretations of Haiti reveal tensions in interpretation itself, social research, and empire. There is no community of human beings in human history who suffered so outrageously in the hands of white people as the unfortunate people who inhabit the island of Haiti, which became a gold mine for white folk and a burial ground for black folk. This gives a sense, a taste of the depth of meaning of Haiti for his understanding, no, of the modern world as a whole. 1791, 1804 revolution, the Haitian Revolution established the Second Republic in the Americas. Proud helped establish the first, even when safe, American army in Savannah, 1779. Also, and he also refers in this writing to how Haitian General Alexander Petion helped Simon Bolivar with arms and money to initiate the independence wars that created Latin America as a world region, and that Bolivar did not recognize that, and that we still do not recognize that as a landmark in Latin American history. I call it Maroon Nation from three angles, and there is a lot in the chapter about that. Because of the leading role of Maroons in the Haitian Revolution and how Du Bois recognized that. Because Haiti was a black state considered pariah in the modern colonial capitalist world system since its inception. And third, the strength and relative autonomy from the Haitian state and the world system of the vernacular cultures of Haitian peasantries, which is another very important theme in terms of that particular culture and its religion, its music, its aesthetics, and its politics of resistance. Next, please. Du Bois and Haiti in the 1940s. There are a number of publications in that period in which Haiti is mentioned that are actually mark a change. That's when Du Bois writes Dust of Dawn and develops is much more mature, I will say, understanding of race and racism in the framework of world capitalism, colonialism. In the Future of Africa in the Americas, 1941, an unpublished article, this is a quote: the policy of racial absorption in Brazil, absorption with Negro suppression through the domination of capital in Jamaica and Cuba, and of racial segregation as in Haiti, and as a legal case in the US. He developed here typology of a comparative analysis of racial formations, racial regimes, and racial politics in the Americas. And this is an important example of this trans-American Pan-Africanism. In 1940s, he published the journal, it's in Spanish there, Phylum, in which actually in each single volume, in each single publication of Phylum, you have references to Latin America and the Caribbean, and two books that are very important that I'm sure that Jorge and Juliana also may comment, which is because it's in their chapters also, Color and Democracy, 1945, and The World in Africa, 1947, where Du Bois elaborates his analysis of racial capitalism and white imperialism as central to global racialized modernity, where in Haiti is a key place. Next, please. I want to show Du Bois with Mao Zedong at the end of his life, in Marx, Tom in London with Charlie Grant Du Bois, and in Haiti, his last visit to Haiti. Next, please. And this is the last one. I hope I haven't talked for more than 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. Haiti at the dust of Du Bois' life. And here have two two quotes from his 1955 memoir published in The Guardian after he came out of Haiti. And I mean, you feel him there. I am sitting in Cave Haitian, March 10, 1955, looking at Christophe Citadel, rising stern on yonder mountain peak. As I sit, I think of what this beautiful island may mean to its people and to the world. 3 weeks in Haiti for two reasons: pressing comfort. I go to the West Indies for song and sea. Second, I wanted to see Haiti. Since my visit in 1944, that was the last time that he saw his beloved island. The nation, real until colonial imperialism, the last phase of world capitalism, stabbed into the wake, into take charge of Haiti. The nation, real until colonial imperialism, the last phase of world capitalism, stepped into to take charge of it. I'm sorry. So here he has a very interesting analysis of what we can call uneven and combined development and international division of labor, anticipating dependency theories. That in my chapter, I explained that at length. What Haiti needed in 1915 and what it needs now is a scientific modernization of her socialism, of her vernacular socialism. That's in the same article, Du Bois, articulating a sort of decolonial politics of liberation, an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist brand of socialism with elements of feminism, but still short in it, that characterized Du Bois' epistemic and political sensibility and his commitment for the liberation of those people who he called the darker races of the world. Thank you very much. We can't hear you.
Hi, Juliana, you're next.
Hello. So again, talking to Agustin, I would like to thank MSU for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I want to thank Laurie, Rashida, Leonora, Rael. So I have some slides. I think they're coming soon. My contribution for this book, it's beyond and over larger themes, it's specific on Du Bois in Brazil. And it was, I'm an Afro-Brazilian, I think it's important to say that. And studying Du Bois' relationship with my country, there was moments of being shocked, being surprised, many emotions. And I'm really glad the opportunity to be sharing this with you today. Let's give 1 second to the slides be up. So in a minute, I was just saying that Du Bois had a relationship with Brazil that is very few people talking about it, but since the beginning of the 20th century, he was studying, he was writing, and he was publishing about Brazil. And he kept his relationship with Brazil until the end of his life. And yes, so this is why Brazil, right? It's not United States. Very few people know that Brazil is quite important if you think in terms of African diaspora, because it is the largest Black country in the Americas. In fact, we are the second largest Black country in the world, the second largest Black population. So with Du Bois being this great Pan-Africanist leader, it's his relationship with Brazil, we figured out many things about Black transnationalism and Black international solidarity. Okay, so I can move on. Do you prefer that I wait a little bit to see if the slides up, or I can continue? It's no problem.
I think it's okay for you to continue, and then we can, is it okay? We can get up. Yeah.
Okay. So Du Bois, he wrote, I'm going to give a little bit my introduction about what's Brazil, what is the basic of Brazil, especially in the 20th century, what was the context in which Du Bois was engaging with Brazil. So Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Indeed, we abolished slavery only in 1888. And after that, until kind of 1930s, one of the main issues of Brazil, and also how to build a nation in Brazil, was how can we build a nation with this much of Black people here? So we had was intellectuals from the time, but also the state, they had what we call the whitening project. They were trying to clean the country from Blackness through miscegenation. So there was some scientists that they'll say that the white blood would purify the Black blood, and with enough miscegenation, people eventually become white. Actually, there was a statistic saying that Brazil would become white by 2012 at that time. And it's important to notice that in Brazil, a race, it's related to how you look. If you have African features, you are Black, regardless of who are your family, who are your parents. So they were thinking that, okay, we can make the country every time lighter until it becomes white. And that was public policies to that. The state was inviting European people to the country, for example, to whiten in the country. From 1930s to after that, until kind of the 1990s, we had a change in Brazil, and we emerged what you call the myth of racial democracy. This was the myth that Brazil was a racial paradise, a place without racism, a perfect place where indigenous, white, and Black people all lived in harmony. This was a big lie. Nowadays, you know that Brazil is one of the countries that most kill Black people in the world. But we had two authoritarian governments in that period, and that was basically what you could say on Brazil, and how our country was exported internationally, but also how our nation started to be built as this kind of racial paradise. So, to be clear, the myth of the racial democracy was actually an idea that served to oppress Afro-Brazilians for a long, long, long time. So when investigating Du Bois' writings about Brazil, I learned that he actually contributed to the myth of racial democracy. So we have publications out that he wrote about Brazil in the Crisis, in the Baltimore African American, but also in the book The Negro from 1915, in which in his analysis about Brazil, he would say that there was no color line in the country. The country, in fact, that the emancipation after slavery was peaceful, and that everybody living in all races were living in harmony and amalgamating. That was a term that he used into a new race. And then I was like, okay, what's happening in that period? What was going on? And what was interesting is that the writings on that Brazil were produced the idea that Du Bois were producing the idea that Brazil was a racial democracy, a racial paradise. They were prior to the one book called Casa Grande and Senzala from Gilberto Freire, that in Brazil is recognized kind of the book who gave the basis for the racial democracy myth. So I was like, okay, there's something we need to investigate. So if you look to the context of that time, you're going to see that it was not only Du Bois reproducing this image in the United States. Actually, Brazil was quite hot until the beginning of the 30s in the Black press in the United States. Many other scholars were, oh, thank you. We can move next. You can move, please. One more, please. Okay, we are there. So many other scholars were and activists in the United States were producing this idea that Brazil is a racial paradise. So Zita Nunes is one of, she gives us in her book Cannibal Democracy a suggestion of why. So because Brazil was trying to whiten the country through miscegenation, there was no segregation. So Brazil was used, especially by African Americans, as a counterpoint to the United States politics, to try to show for the United States government that another segregation was not natural, another way to think racial relations were possible. Indeed, the first publication that I found of Du Bois about Brazil was a response that he did to the ex-president Theodore Roosevelt on race relations in the United States. And I agree with her. So that is, I understand why they could, African Americans, even though they suffered, a lot of them visit Brazil, and even though they suffered racism in Brazil, they could sit at the same table than a white person, right? Or at the same restaurant. So I do understand that it was tempting to say that in Brazil was a racial harmony. But I'm going to argue that there is another reason why Du Bois engaged with the racial democracy myth. He had very strong relationships with white Brazilian scholars. And for one moment, there was a brief alignment of interests between him and these scholars. So here, the first one that shows up is João Lacerda. It's a person that Du Bois, a white Brazilian scholar that Du Bois met in person. And he recommended his work, he read his work, recommended and quoted his work. João Lacerda was one of the intellectuals who would say that miscegenation would whiten people, would improve the race, clean the blackness. Here I have in the middle Arthur Ramos, that is a very important scholar on race relations in Brazil. And the last one is Gilberto Freire himself. And I say Gilberto Freire because in Brazil, his name is very heavy in the sense of he be associated as a person who gave the basis to the racial democracy myth. Du Bois met Gilberto Freire, and he invited Gilberto Freire to work in the Encyclopedia of the Negro. That was one of the Du Bois projects, and also recommended Gilberto Freire's publications for other people. So could you move a little bit, please? Next. And why Du Bois was interacting with these scholars? What was the interest, or what was behind that? So internationally at that time, the view on miscegenation, hegemonic view, was really bad. Miscegenation was seen as something that would weaken the white race. And in fact, Brazil was accused by many, included by the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, to be creating a mongrel population because it was promoting miscegenation. And so Brazilians were trying to break with this idea, and Du Bois thought that it was essential also to break with this idea because for him, white superiority was founded in idea of race purity. And if you could prove that miscegenation was something that existed, and I know that miscegenation has a very heavy connotation in English, but that was the project that Brazilian people have. If they could, if Du Bois thought that if you could prove that since the beginning of humanity, people were mixing with each other, and that there was no poor race, he could put down the myth of white superiority. So here, quite small, it's actually on one paper that he wrote in 1930s, called Miscegenation, in which he makes these arguments that I'm telling here. He tries to break down scientific races, and he does use works of, for example, João Lacerda, to try to prove that there was no poor races in the world, that this was a fantasy and race was an artificial concept. Next, please. So despite this alignment between Du Bois and his work with Brazilian elites and Brazilian white scholars, I just want to say that there was a lot of tension between white Brazilians and African Americans. And this tension, I think that this latter example, it's one example of these tensions, because Brazil was inviting white people, Brazilian government was inviting white people to whiten the country. But African Americans also wanted to go to Brazil because they're like, oh, there's this racial paradise. I want to go there. I want to see. And they started to have their passports denied by the Brazilian government because Brazilian elites never wanted Black people there. Afro-Brazilians, African Americans, they didn't want. So Du Bois wrote to the president of Brazil. So this is the letter that Du Bois wrote to the president of Brazil, requesting what's going on. If you're saying that there was no racism, why are you, do you have any policy to deny the passports for African Americans? How you define the mid-race people? We also gonna be denied. So he questioned, and all the African Americans was also questioned this policy in Brazil, showing that despite the alignment, there were tensions. Next, please. It's important to say that in the 40s, Du Bois changed his opinion on Brazil. In The Future of African America, that was one of his papers, he actually wrote that economic class, when color combined with poverty, has kept a large class of darker laborers in a depressed condition. This is referring to Brazil, and that unless racial absorption is going to be accompanied by economic democracy of equals, the solution of the Brazilian problem of Africa and America cannot be really accomplished. In this paper, it was a paper that he presented at the Vassar College. He was actually really hard on the fact that Brazil, that was racism, was not a racial paradise, and the solution to deal with the Negro problem was problematic. Why did Du Bois change his opinion? Next, please. So I'm going to go really brief here. I won't say that other people other African Americans were changing their opinion in that moment. I'm not going to get into detail, but I want to highlight especially Renee Diggs and Catherine Durham that visited Brazil and helped the fight against anti-Blackness in Brazil. Next, please. In the same moment that Du Bois was working, that Du Bois changed his opinion. So my argument on that is we cannot understand the change on Du Bois, on Du Bois' perspective on Brazil without understand a broader change in his scholarship. So we know that in 1933, he published Black Reconstruction in America, and he became one very important figure for Black radicalism and Black Marxism. And this change, his approximation with Marxism also was reflected as changing his perspective of what liberation means. So it's quite easy in Brazil to see racism if you look for our economic structure. Most of the Black people are poor and very poor, if you consider the difference with white people. And what Du Bois was actually criticizing in the previous paper that I mentioned was this, that the large amount of Black Afro-Brazilians are in situation of poverty. And the change on liberation is that if before it was tempting to say that Brazil is a racial paradise because you could go to Brazil and sit on the same restaurant than a white person, inclusion was not enough anymore. Du Bois he became a radical. He was thinking, okay, I don't want to be in the same restaurant if I'm not truly recognized as equal, if our people are still dying without food. So this change from inclusion to emancipation made Brazil stop to be desirable. Okay, we can interact with white people, but Black people are not free there. So I situate Du Bois' change in Brazil on this major change in his scholarship and definition of Black liberation. Next, please. Unfortunately, he not fully changed his opinion. In some other publications later, he still say that despite the problems in Brazil, social equality of Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes were recognized without question. So this is actually the prospect of world race prospect of a world without race conflict from 1944. Next, please. So he changed it, but not fully. And I was trying to understand why he never actually criticized miscegenation as a whitening project, although he recognized racism in Brazil. So my take on this is that he still kept interacting, especially with white Brazilians. Later in his life, Du Bois was accused of betraying the United States because of his association with socialism and his work as a peace activist, and he went to trial. It was a quite traumatic experience for him. And international solidarity was essential to keep Du Bois out of jail. And this letter, it's a letter that signed by Jorge Amado, that is a white Brazilian, very important writer, and Pablo Neruda, another very important Latin American writer too. They're one of the people who mobilized and created and brought people together international defense of Du Bois. And Du Bois, even though he changed his relationships, now he's not talking mainly with Gilbert Freire, not white scholars. Now he was talking mainly with socialists and peace activists internationally. His main relationships were still with white Brazilians and white Brazilians that reproduced the idea of a racial democracy. Next, please, and I'm gonna conclude. Just the next is, I sorry that you cannot read, the contrast not well, but I just want to say that this was the only document that I found in the archive in which Brazil and Black Brazilian wrote to Du Bois, and was in the same context, was actually Edson Carneiro, and he wrote saying that for Du Bois that the Brazilian Negro population was 100% behind him against the accusations that he was suffering. Next, please, and I conclude for sure. Sorry. So this was a little bit of the data that I gathered for this book, and I'm gonna conclude without a conclusion, in the sense that I'm gonna bring a question for us to debate. That what can you learn about trans-American Pan-Africanism and about Black solidarity and Black transnationalism with Du Bois' interaction with Brazil? Because I have some on the book. I quote some, I explore some things, but I think that it's important to remember that Du Bois' intention was never to contribute to a myth that oppressed Black Brazilians. Du Bois' intentions were always to free Black people in every single part of the world. We had a little bit challenges in the past, right? So what we can learn from that, including to strengthen our Black transnationalism nowadays. So that is a question for us to end, and I want again to thank you, everyone, for the invitation.
Thank you, Juliana. That was great. We'll hear from Jorge next, and then we'll have a debate at the end with questions from the viewers, which they can post either on YouTube or Facebook Live. Jorge?
Well, as Juliana and Agustin, I will also like to start saying thank you to Rashida, Leonora, and Lori for setting this event and let us the opportunity to speak about our incoming book. Actually, my presentation will match with some of the ideas that Juliana already mentioned. That's part of the introduction of the book, trying to compare how Cuba and Brazil were part of this important shift in the analysis of the global color line, and I will argue also the racialized modernity in Du Bois' writings during the 1940s. So I will be reading so I can hopefully be on time for presenting all these ideas. Okay, so I don't pretend you to actually read from the slides. I just want to use some pictures and some quotes just for giving you an idea of this book. So I think the presentation is not working well because there should be a title there. So let's see how it goes. Yeah, so it's not working. I don't know whether you're going to be able to see the pictures in the next slide. Try the next slide, please, Rael. Could you? Okay, yeah, so it's gonna work. Yeah, so the aim of my contribution is setting a basis for thinking on W.E.B Du Bois as an intellectual of the Global South, from the analysis of his relationship with Cuban intellectuals, as also from his writings about Cuba during the 1940s and during the 1930s and 40s. The focus on Cuba is not neutral, since it played a special role, not only because its multiple connections with socialism in Europe and in the United States, but because of the place of the anti-racist struggle in the construction of republicanism in the Caribbean. In the study of the Du Bois-Cuba relationship, I identified two spaces. The first has as its material for analysis the correspondence of Du Bois that Du Bois had with Cuban intellectuals in order to recreate Du Bois' connections with Latin America. This analysis refers to the establishment of points of mutual strengthening, as well as the contextualized difference of the place of anti-racism in the criticism of national projects in the United States and Cuba. The second space refers to how Du Bois' connections with Gustavo Urrutia and Fernando Ortiz during these decades drive a way to explore the global connections that contributed to the formation of a critique of a racialized modernity and the historical analysis of the global color line. So what you are watching here in this slide is just to have an idea of how the Gustavo Urrutia's writings in the Cuban press, especially in the Diario de la Marina, the important newspaper, looked like. Gustavo Urrutia maintained the opinion column Ideales de una Raza in the most relevant newspaper, Diario de la Marina, and covered between 1928 and 1931 current events from the analysis of racism, colonialism, and inequality in Cuba. During the 1930s, he continued writing the column Armonías until 1950s. However, the connection between Urrutia and Du Bois was initially given by the publication of some of Urrutia's writings in The Crisis, directed by Du Bois in 1910. Next slide, please. In January 1931, Urrutia wrote to The Crisis in response to the situation described by the educator and civil rights activist Mary McLeod Bethune in December 1930. The open letter from Bethune, founder and by then former president of the National Association of Colored Women, addressed to Urrutia, describing the racial discrimination suffered by the port authorities upon her arrival in Cuba. Bethune was denied entry to the country and was only admitted after contacting the American embassy. As historian Frank Guridy describes, the development of Black tourism between the United States and Cuba was fundamental when it came to building the Afro-diasporic ties between these two countries. However, Guridy affirms that African-American trips to Cuba implied dealing with the global operation of the color line and exposing themselves, in a random sense, to harassment partly influenced by the predominance of white tourism in Cuba. In his response to the crisis, Urrutia raised the situation experienced by Bethune not only as an example of how racism manifests the tensions around borders, but the effects that racial discrimination in the United States has in Cuba. In those years, the anti-migratory discourse in the United States had a central argument to stop the mobility of African Americans to the north of the country in order to protect the jobs of white workers. Thus, Urrutia's response demonstrated how aware he was of the intersection between racism and anti-immigrant hostility in the northern country, and how such intersection was inscribed in a matrix of inequality, denying the blacks of the South the right to mobility that any American had. Urrutia's response to the crisis affirmed that if anyone should be ashamed of such discriminatory treatment, it should not be Bethune, but Cuba, that even with a rhetoric of equality racial even with a rhetoric of racial equality, their rulers were unable to discard ideas like those prevailing in the country of the North. This response was also published in Diario de la Marina and was part of Urrutia's strategy in using the analysis of racism in the United States to confront the discourse of a raceless nation in Cuba. But Urrutia was not a lonely voice. His ideas were anchored in various intellectual circles. Urrutia will also integrate the political intellectual circle in the newspaper Adelante from 1935 to 1939, which functions as an expression of the anti-racist struggle, denouncing the legacy of the abuses of the dictatorship of General Machado. In this newspaper, the problem of Cuban blacks was debated, at the same time that economic reparation was demanded in response to the political participation of black people in Cuban republicanism. So what we are watching here in the slide are the pieces that from Urrutia who were translated into English for the crisis. Next slide, please. Okay. In March 1936, González Ortigoz wrote for Adelante, this is the name of the newspaper, a profile of W.E.B Du Bois, in which the latter appears to be an analyst of the historical injustice to blacks in the United States, highlighting his intellectual conflict with Booker T. Washington and his research at the Atlanta University. Although in Adelante, the bibliographic work of Du Bois stands out, the reference to the knowledge of his work about the structural aspect of discrimination against blacks within national projects reveals a particular reading shared by this political intellectual collective. In Adelante, the profile of Du Bois is next to the journalist and activist writer Alberto Arredondo's piece, The Negro and the Problem of Nationality. in which he affirms that the cause of the Negro is the cause of nationality. For Arredondo, there was not possible integration without the Negro. Though Black and nation cannot be disengaged, it is crucial to consider how Black population in Cuba is overexploited. That is what Arredondo was writing in that piece. I see Urrutia, Arredondo, and Du Bois addressing the problem of the nation, not in a separatist sense, but insofar as their work allowed to debate the very concept of nation. The time between the Great Depression and World War II was undoubtedly a time when Black political thought reflected on the national question. Du Bois always presented a frontal attack on the anti-statist liberalism that coexisted with segregation. According to Nickel Palsain, when Du Bois in 1930s described Blacks as a nation within the nation, the term nation was above all a mechanism of communication and common regulation that indicated the unique character of the density of the Black existence resulting from racial segregation. Next slide, please. As stated in The Negro and Social Reconstruction, this is a piece that remained unpublished during Du Bois' lives, and then it was published later by in a volume edited by Herbert Aptenger here at UMass. As stated in The Negro and Social Reconstruction, the task was clearly to produce public awareness that goes beyond the vision by which the Black population is seen only in relationship to the people of the United States. There was a time when the American Negroes thought of themselves simply in relation to the people of the United States, and it was then that we argued that there could be but two methods of settling the Negro problem. Either the Negro would be absorbed physically into the nation, or else he would die out by violence or neglect. Since the World War, this attitude has changed. Not only do we realize that the majority of the peoples of the world are colored, but we also realize that the unquestioned supremacy of the white race over these colored people has passed forever. Besides Du Bois' argument in The Negro and Social Reconstruction functioning as the basis for the rejection of the assimilationist project or Black assimilationism of the North American nation state, and to demand a political solution that allows the strengthening of common Black interests at their political interests as well. At the same phase, Du Bois considered that Black democratic participation in politics was a precondition for achieving social justice in the United States, not by avoiding the racial question or denying race, but by using the racial category to expand the field of the political debate. Next slide, please. Like Du Bois, Urrutia, in Adelante, questioned the demo-liberalism and pointed out how to create the nation in order to resolve social and economic problems of Black Cubans in his famous article, The New Negro. Du Bois' connection with Urrutia, as well as other pieces from Cuban residents to the crisis, contributed to shore up his position in favor of an existing and relatively autonomous public sphere, not only nationally, but globally. Next slide, please. While, here you are not able to see the picture. I don't know whether I can share my screen. Would that be possible? So you can see the picture. So, well, this is where you are not able to see is a picture of Du Bois' first visit to Cuba. So where he did this here in the special collection of Du Bois records. So, well, okay, so I should continue. So there is no way to share that. While Du Bois' relationship with Cuba began through the publications in the crisis, Du Bois' engagement with Cuba is especially significant in the 1940s. In general, it occurs within the effort to establish global struggle against racism. It was especially within these conditions that Du Bois and the anthropologist Irene Dix personally met the prominent Cuban intellectual Fernando Ortiz on his first visit to Cuba on January 5th, 1941. What Du Bois originally thought as 10 days of a quiet rest in a colored country was in fact a space for building links within the fight against racism in Cuba and in the United States. Following the advice of the Puerto Rican historian Richard Patty, Du Bois wrote to Ortiz to comment on his on his incoming visit to Cuba. Ortiz invited Du Bois to talk with the members of the Afro-Cuban Studies Society, founded and chaired by him since 1936. Next slide, please. Du Bois had heard about this journal through the communications that Rayford Logan established with Du Bois around the project of creating an encyclopedia of the Negro. Ortiz also designed a meeting schedule that included social meetings, a visit to the University of Havana, as well as the meeting with Presidente Fulgencio Batista that did not happen. During his 2 weeks in Cuba, Du Bois not only participated in an event at the Club Atenas, an organ of the Afro-Cuban intellectual elite, but also toured the island of Cuba from its capital to the Oriente province, stopping in Santa Clara, Trinidad, Camagüey, until reaching Santiago de Cuba. Miguel Ángel Céspedes, president of Cuban Atenas, of the Club Atenas, addressed communications to authorities and associations of color in the provincial capitals, announcing Du Bois and Dick's visit. Next slide, please. On June 10th, together with Fernando Ortiz, Du Bois met Cuban legislator Francisco de Lunde. The congressman asked Du Bois for a comment on a proposed law against discrimination on race or color. The project was drawn by communist politicians and representatives of workers' organizations as a consequence of the debates on the Negro problem that took place within the framework of the 1940 Constitution, which included for the first time specific articles against racial discrimination in Cuba. Mercer Cook, diplomat and an Atlanta University professor, translated the bill for Du Bois. Upon delivering the translation, he stated, "If only something like it could be made effective here," referring to the United States. Therefore, Du Bois learned about the strong Cuban colored associations, especially those of the elite, but also those that were not in Havana. He learned of the work of legislators around the bill in the heat of the Constitution of the 1940. Itchinson and Brown have demonstrated that W.E.B Du Bois sociology, in its different manifestations, was a sociology of a racialized modernity. They show how the analysis of modernity required critical tools such as a phenomenology of the subaltern subjects, the articulation of racism and colonialism within capitalism, the historically grounding analysis of the communities, as well as the criticism and action against the racial discrimination in the terrain of knowledge production. I'd argue that Du Bois' writings on Cuba in 1941 contributed to his sociology of a racialized modernity, especially in how he referred to the global color line in his writings during this decade. Next slide, please. So 5 minutes left. Okay. In November of the same year, 1941, Du Bois visited Cuba for the second time together with other Latin American intellectuals to attend the International Conference for Intellectual Cooperation organized by UNESCO in Havana. Both Du Bois and Ortiz placed the issue of race at the center of their analysis of the war. This meeting was followed by an exchange of letters on the possibility of organizing in Cuba a Congress of Studies for the African American culture or for the Pan-African culture. However, there are elements that demand that the reading of Du Bois and Ortiz regarding the racial question be done from the confrontation of their arguments. Before meeting Du Bois personally in 1929, Ortiz had referred to Du Bois' book Black Folk, Then and Now, published that same year in the Revista Bimestre Cubana. Next slide, please. Black Folk was published with the purpose of demonstrating the contribution of Afro-descendant peoples in the construction of the modern world. Even today, this is considered a book for critical sociology of race. Ortiz suggests that Du Bois reaches racist views when referring to Cuba. So this is when this becomes complicated. Regarding the modern history of Cuba, the author is very confused and with a discriminatory background that would make one presume a racist spirit that takes its black logic to illogical and unjust extremes. The work of 1895 seems to have been all the work of Antonio Maceo. Martí and Máximo Gómez are not mentioned. The political history of Cuba is the Republican, it seems entirely dominated by Morúa Delgado. So, even though we are, okay, so I still have 1 more minute to conclude. So what I'm arguing is that even though Du Bois had this connection with Fernando Ortiz, their way to consider racism on the analysis of race in global perspective was pretty different. However, it was not his personal relationship with Fernando Ortiz what is most relevant for this moment, but how this connection allowed him to get to know Cuban associations and to become familiar with the analysis of the color line, in terms that Du Bois will say that what he was already reading and studying about Cuba during the 1930s finally led him the opportunity to confront with this experience in Cuba, and it will become relevant in his writings from the next slide, please. In his writings from the late from the 40s. So his paper, "The Future of Cuba, of African America, the World and Africa, and Color and Democracy," as well as "An Appeal to the World," were writings where we can track, how these little pieces that Du Bois wrote about Cuba actually were incorporated in some sense in this other work about racial global color line. Thank you. So I'm sorry that the presentation didn't work well. I mean, I can send it, to you if you want to watch the picture from the archives. Yeah.
Thank you, Jorge. Yeah, I believe we will all appreciate that image, to be able to see that image. Thank you all, panelists. This was a really interesting talk, and I think it opens up room for different kinds of conversation, and I think we can enter this conversation from different angles. So I will encourage our audience to pose questions if they have any. We'll start with one question. First, I would like to offer one comment, and then we'll have one question, and then we can hopefully have a productive debate once we start this conversation. So it's really interesting to hear from you this exchange, right, between Du Bois and the many different Latin American intellectuals, and how they were in a way learning from each other in terms of conceptualizations and even in terms of policy, as Jorge was expressing in his presentation, right? Cuban policies that were enacted in order to refrain racist practices that how could the United States could, for instance, learn from and potentially implement something similar. So the exchange here is really interesting, but I'm interested in something too that that Agustin mentioned at the very beginning, which was this idea of a Duboisian Renaissance happening now and thinking globally, right? One of the reasons why we also have this amazing book coming out as a contribution to this dialogue, right, about a Duboisian Renaissance. But I'm interested in I would love to hear from you about this. My question is, how much is this Renaissance, right, as this new readings of Du Bois and his contributions, how much is that grounded on decolonial practices of liberation rooted in practices of marronage, right, or quilombismo, when we were thinking of these three countries, right? When we're thinking about Haiti, when we're thinking about Brazil, as Cuba, and as well as Cuba, as really rich grounds where practices of marronage and the formation of runaway slave communities happened. Do we have a sense of that? Do we have a sense that a new reading of Du Bois could happen within this framework of marronage, if we're thinking of decolonial politics of liberation? So I would love to hear from the panelists their thoughts about this.
Augustine, I think you.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to hear from the other two colleagues also, because it's an interesting question to for everybody here. Now, I mean, I will start by saying, kind of going around the question, by saying that Du Bois is like Fanon. Is a classic in the full sense of the meaning of the word. I mean, is 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 a gigantic figure, scholar, intellect, scholar, activist, and I would like to underline scholar activist, because you won't be able to understand his work if you don't place it into to the terrain of politics, of being always motivated by a political project. Now his intellectual project that goes more than 90 years. Now it goes over a whole century. It's the late 19th century and almost the whole of 20th century is quite long and complex, and it's lent itself to many different kind of readings. And I will say that, and he himself, when the chapter on Haiti only demonstrate, and as Jorge and Juliana also did, the tremendous changes in his own ways of relating, especially to Brazil, that have a longer relationship. And Juliana demonstrate how in Du Bois' analytical and political sensibilities are going to consider a shift in his the way that he relates to Brazil, to racial democracy, etc. The same thing happened with Haiti. At the beginning, he has a much more liberal project. In the letter that he wrote to Woodrow Wilson in 1915, he was actually asking the U.S. to have a benign relationship, but he was not against the occupation. And in the process, he goes turns to be against the occupation, and he turns to be a much more radical kind of scholar, intellectual, that lends himself much more to a decolonial reading. So there is that is a primacy today, and I'm really delighted about that, of a decolonial reading of Foucault as a critic of racialized modernity. And somehow he will always was, but he was not as much as a fundamental critic as he was later on his life. But yes, I would say that the hegemonic way of reading Du Bois and developing an analytics and a politics out of Du Bois today is the colonial, wherein marionette could play an important role. I don't think that it had, though, as much as it could. That's why I actually uh, titling the chapter Maroon Nation, precisely to make an intervention along those lines of understanding how Haiti, his complex understanding of Haiti as a maroon nation in two different ways, as his recognition, Du Bois' recognition that Maroons are actually the leaders, the rank and file, the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. It's a given reading of the Haitian Revolution, not even Taylor James all the time read it that way. Second, as a pariah state, because it's a state that its value is denied since the very beginning. No, the U.S. does not recognize Haiti until the late 19th century. Haiti is somehow still paying for the debt supposedly to France, because of the property of the French planters and the French imperial state. And this idea of a pariah nation as a maroon nation, which is something that Frederick Douglass, who was, as you know, was ambassador of the U.S. to Haiti, the first one, articulated. And the third one, which is very, very important, that Du Bois recognized how Haitian peasantries, because in Haiti there is the first, as Sidney Means very well said, in Haiti there was the first agrarian reform in the Americas. and based on small property owning. And this Haitian peasantry that always resisted, you resisted even to Saint Louverture and Dessalines' attempt to create what they call a plantation without slavery. And they resisted to that, and that is the foundation of a vernacular culture, Vodun, Haitian culture, its own Africana popular culture, is a maroon culture. And Du Bois is the first one who recognized that on his writings about Haiti. So through these three lines, we are in the book developing this reading of Du Bois through a decolonial maroon kind of lens. And in that way, he's inscribing in that long tradition of maroonage that you have in MSSL, you have in Edouard Glissant, in C.L. James himself. So that way, inscribe in Sylvia Wynter. That way, you inscribe Du Bois in that longer tradition that could speak with quilombismo, no, in Brazil, with the quilombismo of Nascimento, Abdias Nascimento, etc. So that's a long answer, but I cannot do it in a shorter way.
Leonora, your mic.
Yeah. You're muted. Wait, you're muted again. Oh, technology. I'll jump in there while Leonora, I think your mic is still muted. And just say thank you for that explanation. As you were talking, I was making some connections, and I didn't know if Juliana or Jorge, if you had anything to add to that question. I don't.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief, but I just want to add two things. First, that one of the things that I try to bring with my research on the boys in Brazil is that what is Black liberation, it's actually something that we build with time and with a lot of dispute in the Black community and with changes. And what is the colonial liberation of Maroon and Quilombismo are things that I feel are still we're still defining in this, in the sense that what it really means emancipation is still something that it's an ongoing project. And that being said, something that concerns me, and I think that we bring this in this book, is that the boys' Renaissance, it's very important, but sometimes we can fall in the trap of the problem of the hero. To picture people as these perfect figures and this, it's important to remember that even our most radical ancestors also that was questions, that was issues, and to explore that, it's important to bring the boys' Renaissance as not as the perfect person, but to explore, okay, what didn't work in the past, so we can move forward in the future in a different way. So I think that one of the contributions of this book, and we talked about among ourselves about that, was that we don't want to represent a myth, the boys as a myth. We don't want to fall on this trap. We want to explore the little details and the complexities of even how the Liberation Project changed through his life, and it sometimes connected and sometimes didn't connect with the colonial and with Maroonage. And I think that one of the examples is when you think in terms of the talent and theft, and somehow how the boys had a little bit of this elitism, right? Many of his relationship, for example, with white Brazilians are related to this level of these scholars, these academics contacts, but also in Cuba. And in fact, he does recognize this in the book that he writes about his trial, that he says, oh, I was wrong because I thought that the Black bourgeoisie was the one that was going to make the revolution. But he was abandoned by doing when he was in trial. So he said, now I understand that the working class that is going to move forward. But so I explore these nuances, these details. I feel that is extremely important. It's so it can bring up Du Bois Renaissance with a more a more solid way. And to conclude also quickly, it's just sometimes Du Bois, in a sense, that there's also the tendency to what part of Du Bois is accepted by mainstream public, right? Du Bois, Du Bois who wrote the Soul of Black Folk is a very important voice, but Du Bois also who was at the end of his life for a more radical perspective. No, it's not everybody. That Du Bois was accused of betraying the United States. Mm-hmm. So I feel that it's also important to bring, like, okay, in this Du Bois Renaissance, we want to filter Du Bois, if not, bring out this and bring that his was not only. He became a very important radical scholar, and that is, I think it's important to bring everything more when you're talking about the Bois Renaissance.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So I will also try to be brief. Well, so I have two comments. First, in the case of Cuba, I guess that rereading Du Bois in Cuba contributes to take into question the myth of the mestizo nation, in terms that in Cuba, even there is a important movement criticism with taking into question the myth of non-raceless society in Cuba, especially because of the important policies that the Cuban Revolution enacted, for racial equality. So there is still today there is a topic that is very complicated to address, and that's in part because of Fernando Ortiz, this prominent anthropologist, became the most relevant figure, for processing the understanding of race. I mean, like in common life, in schools, in everyday discourses, the metaphors that Fernando Ortiz built are really important for that. So when we read the relationship with Ortiz with Du Bois, we can see how there are two different ways of addressing the problem of race, not only in Cuba but in the Caribbean in general and in global perspective. So here there is this important thing in my work, is that when Du Bois went to Cuba, he was in contact with the white scholars who were writing about race from a cultural perspective. So for Ortiz, the problem of race is a cultural problem. But Du Bois didn't visit Cuba during the 1930s, when there was all these black activists and intellectuals writing and discussing with Ortiz. So for the 1940s, it's Ortiz matrix, which is already in place, like kind of, it turns in a more accepted way of discussing race. So I want to question that, the idea of this sort of mestizaje as a way to solve racial conflict in the way that in Cuba specifically it took place, by confronting Ortiz with Du Bois. And the other aspect is a way of, I'm looking for contribute to the discussion of the decolonial perspective, because in some readings of the colonial theory or the colonial perspective in Latin America, there is still this sort of essentialism and culturalism that disconnect the decolonial perspective from its political economy and global construction of racial hierarchies, So that's not uncommon in Latin America. For example, they are the way that some decolonial authors write about Aníbal Quijano and disconnect Quijano from the political economy or material analysis, the way they reread some of the authors that Agustin mentioned, so sometimes they are only considered as authors that process through culture, through identity, the racial conflict. And for Du Bois, it was not the case. So I am trying to make that point clear.
Okay. We are low on time, but we had a question from someone that was tuning in and live, and so I wanted to pose the question to the group, but I also wanted to just thank you all for, and Juliana highlighted the importance of the work that you all are doing in not upholding Du Bois as a myth, but also showing his complexity. And Augustine, when you talked about him being guided by political project, right? It really helps for us to keep in mind the ways in which Du Bois develops and is, shifting his analysis given the historical and political moments that are require it. And so that's something that I also try to convey to my students at the undergraduate level when they want to go strictly to the talented 10th as a critique or, this one aspect of his work that they learn about to, have a, one analysis of Du Bois. So I really appreciate this. So the question from one of our audience members asked about the concept of psychological wage. And I think that's from Black Reconstruction. And he writes, there's been an attempt to operationalize this concept of psychological wage. And I just wanted to, I know that wasn't a concept that you all talked about explicitly, but I wanted to ask if you had any comments about that with regards to the operationalization of that as a concept in current day social movements as it applies to, I think he clarified around anti-Black racism and fights against anti-Black racism. And I'm guessing at the global level, not just in the United States.
Well, one of the important things about that concept that came out in Black Reconstruction is that is one of the tenets of the studies of whiteness. I mean, it's a psychological wedge of whiteness, and that is a very important book written by David Rudiger called Wedges of Whiteness, which is a history of how white identities in different sectors of the U.S. working class have accounted for fractures in the possibility of a unified labor movement and a robust socialist project in the U.S. And I think that the field of whiteness studies that is began, it was created by Black scholars, but it's something that is coming out of the Black radical tradition. Du Bois being one of the main people in the Black radical tradition that brings the race as a relation, as a social relation, wherein it's not only about Blackness, it's about whiteness, it's about other ethnic racial groupings, historical groupings, to understand the complexity of racial formation, racisms, and racial politics. And in order to combat white supremacy and anti-Black racism, we need to understand whiteness. And in Latin America, we are actually just beginning in whiteness studies. In Brazil, there are a number of books published, but it's just recent. In Colombia, there are people doing that, but we still need to have a much more complex understanding of what race and racial formation is, wherein the understanding of whiteness is crucial. And that's something that we owe to Du Bois and to the Du Boisian tradition. And that takes me to this Du Bois Renaissance that I entirely agree with Juliana and Jorge, that entails a complex readings of Du Bois and readings, radical readings, in the sense of readings that are going to exploit, in the good sense, the potential that Du Bois have of being an inspiration for decolonial theory, critical theory, and politics of liberation.
Yeah, and also
absolutely. I don't know, Rashida. I don't know.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Everything went down. Now I think I'm back. So if I may do a very small contribution also on this concept, it's quite important. And it's I feel that it's important not academically, but also for activism. When we are out in the show, something that I always say when I am outside academic walls, sometimes in the activist world, is look, the fight, people supporting the fight against anti-Blackness is not necessarily because you need, I want to support Black people. It's to understand that anti-Blackness is structured, the systems that affected even like the white poor. So if you want to be free, you want to destroy these structures. But Du Bois points out that the problem with the labor movement is because there was this thing that, I can be poor, but at least I'm not Black. Doesn't matter if I'm being oppressed, like if I'm being oppressed by a structure that is sustained by anti-Blackness, I'm not Black, so I'm cool. So I always say, look, if you want to support anti-Black, the fight against anti-Black struggle is your only link to true revolution. But I think that in this concept, when you think in this work, particularly of Du Bois' interaction with Latin America, there is a complex point that is when you put imperialism on it. Because why I'm saying that, for the example with white Brazilians, the white Brazilians are white people, but they come to, and the white Latinos are white people, but they come to the United States, that somehow take it out to the white category. And that was actually what's happening with Brazil. The United States were looking to white Brazilians and were saying, oh, you're creating a mongrel population. We don't want to accept you as white people anymore because you have mixed blood, because you are promoting a country for politics of mixed blood. So a little bit of the alignment between Brazil, Du Bois, and white Brazilians came off this thing that what is the category of whiteness and Blackness? It's this expertism what finds when we add imperialism, and I think that is important, especially when you think in trans-American Pan-Africanism, because we're talking about especially United States imperialism toward Latin America and Caribbean. So white Brazilians, they were. I didn't really went through the concept of psychological weight in my work, but something that I do work with is that, okay, they were white, they wanted to be white, they didn't want to be Black, they didn't want to be mixed or whatever, and they wanted to sustain anti-Blackness in their country, but they're fighting against US politics of segregation and miscegenation because they're taken out of the white category by the US. And this shows like how this psychological weight, it's become even more complicated when we add how colonizing it's connected with colonialism and imperialism. So yeah, my short contribution for that part.
Yeah, just a couple of words. So when we were thinking about Du Bois in Latin America, I just want to share that I found some of other colleagues that would say, well, are you trying to do with Du Bois something like has been done with Hegel and Haiti in that very famous piece by Susan Buckmore, or the most recent discussion on the role of Islam in Foucault's scholarship, So this kind of trying to find something that was there in Du Bois' work and that was kind of truly influencing the ways that he worked, trying to find something that was being hidden, for the Du Boisian tradition, which is the place of Latin America. And so we decided, so we were plainly aware that we don't want to take that road. I mean, it's not about the many details of the scholar, about his life, where he was, who he talked to, but how we can actually follow up the pattern that Juliet Hooker or Tiana Pachel referred to in their book, when they say that we can think about the Americas in these transnational connections, and that's the way that global sociology is not something that only we can consider from now, but we can also trace it in the connections in the global South, which is what Du Bois was trying to do in terms of the South in the North and this Southern perspective in the Southern Hemisphere, in fact. Yeah.
Thank you, Jorge. I believe there was a question about the relationship between Du Bois and white Brazilians, and Juliana mentioned a little bit about the mindset of white Brazilians. I don't know if you'll have a time to answer. that question or any other questions. Rashida, do you have any other questions that might be brief?
No, not brief. You all will probably get some emails from me, just my curiosity. So whenever you have a chance.
I think we are running out of time. So I would like to thank the panelists for being here in this virtual world environment and sharing amazing insight with us and the audience. I would love to continue this conversation at some other time, and especially after the book is published, to have a dialogue about its reception, which might be really interesting, thinking of its reception in the United States, as well as in the scholarship about Cuba and Haiti and Brazil and in its respective countries. So that could be potentially a future invitation for a continuation of this conversation. But I would like to thank you very much for being here and thank the audience for participating. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thanks. See you.
Thank you. Gracias. Muito obrigado.
Thank you.
Gracias. Bye bye.
Bye.